Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come all you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회 주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 백승의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강중대국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 붉은 정신력 그 배짱으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다.
세계여보라. 기업의 승리하여 백거의 공격전 그 뒤에 불러
조선 결심하면 한다 조선 한다면 한다 Por
내겐 남긴 세력지 야우진 다라게 대복시마 어던지니 헌치세 어더지민 헌치세 내때문이 소스테호웅 내리지 바다를 흘려쇼
Vietnam brûle et moi je hurle Mao Mao. Johnson rigole et moi je vole Mao Mao. Le napalm coule et moi je roule Mao Mao. Les villes crèvent et moi je rêve Mao Mao. Les putains crient et moi je ris Mao Mao. je joue Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
L'impérialisme dicte partout sa loi. La révolution n'est pas un dîner. La bomba est un tigre en papier. Les masses sont les véritables héros. Les ricains tuent et moi je mue Mao Mao. Les fous sont rois et moi je bois Mao Mao. Les bombes tonnent et moi je sonne Mao Mao. Les bébés fuient et moi je fuis Mao Mao. Les Russes mangent et moi je danse Mao Mao. Diable dénonce, je renonce Mao Mao.
C'est le petit livre rouge qui fait que tout enfin bouge.
La base de l'armée, c'est le soldat. Le vrai pouvoir est au bout du fusil. Les monstres seront tous anéantis. L'ennemi ne périt pas de lui-même. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao. Mao Mao.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see at the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, they're looking for monkeys up at the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Connan baked a cake and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake pretending I was barmy. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, me curse upon the Labour Blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he bait the enemy with his mouth and save the British Army. Tee-oo-ra-loo-ra-loo-ra-loo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.
Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die Vater trug durch die Not. Die Fahne ist niemals gefallen, so oft auch der Träger fiel. Sie weht heute über uns allen und zieht schon der Sehnsucht Ziel. Ich trage eine Fahne, das Rot der Arbeitermacht. Es hat die Arbeiterfahne bei Nacht mein Vater bewacht und hat sie mir früh übergeben, als Morgenrot stieg empor, dass wir sie zur Sonne heben, bei Tag in der Kampfbeschwör. Ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Es ist die Arbeiterfahne, die uns die Einheit gebot. Sie hat unsere Väter begleitet durch Ade und Nacht und Krieg. Drum vorwärts die Söhne erstreitet, zu Ende den großen Sieg.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It is the evening of the 10th of December, 2024, and we are here today with a live stream talking about siege warfare and color revolutions, and can they be stopped? Now, short answer, yes, but it'll take a very certain form of system to do so. Now, before we begin, a couple of words on the situation in Syria. Seeing an awful lot of stories floating around, and I wanted to go back and just comment on what I regard as likely and unlikely options here. Because first of all, the thing to say that we have to emphasize is that the idea that Syria was governed by Bashar al-Assad in a sort of one-man band fashion, in that he was the sole and totalitarian dictator, this sort of stupid juvenile fantasy that the bourgeois media peddle, and that most of the British and American left buy into, that he was this sort of sole man in charge of everything. This is just simply not true. It's not true even in the sense of the way in which the Syrian state was organized in its later years. Nor is it the case that the Syrian Ba'ath ruled as the sole party. There were other parties represented in the old Syrian parliament, including one of the Syrian communist parties, at least one of the Syrian communist parties. There are at least two, one of which was represented there. Assad, in fact, held free bourgeois democratic elections in the civil war period. In the I'll call it for what it is, the war of aggression waged by US imperialism period, and actually won those free elections. So this dictator, sole totalitarian ruler crap needs to be thrown out, because it just simply isn't true. It doesn't accord with reality. Now, I know that's never stopped the imperialists, but it should, of course, be something that we emphasize. So when talking about, well, who did what, who sold out, who capitulated, what did Assad do, A, B, or C? We must stop focusing just purely on the figure of Assad as an individual, and looking, as some do, for explanations as to, what mood was he in, etc., as if it was like as if the moods of one man could change destiny here, could change the way in which things were going to work out. The truth is that not only was Syria a multi-party state until recently, but also that the government, of course, as every single government does, regardless of whether it is capitalist or socialist, represents certain different trends. Now, in the Syrian government's case, it represented different trends in the Ba'ath party, and also beyond it, represented different layers of Syrian society, different classes within Syrian society. And that is crucial to understand if we are to understand what happened. Because it is my view that the talk of the Russians sold Assad out, the Chinese sold Assad out, the Iranians sold Assad out. Now, we don't know for certain what happened, but I think we have a pretty good idea. Now, there are some that say that Assad himself wanted to move towards an alliance with the Gulf monarchies, and that this was one of the key reasons why everything fell to pieces. Essentially, the money from the Gulf monarchies was used to purchase essentially comprador elements within the Syrian government, and it was this that ultimately led to the collapse. What can't be doubted is that, first of all, the Syrian army and its commanders, this is confirmed, or many of the commanders simply refused to deploy their men and refused to fight. Many units led by their officers just fled the field. Now, of course, we can only do an educated guess as to why, but certainly what has been confirmed, and again, this has been talked about by Russian, off-the-record government sources, Iranian sources have also said this, that the Syrian government changed over its commanders in 2018, 2019, got rid of the successful commanders, brought in well, others who were unproven and who apparently were more to the liking of the Gulf states. So who was seeking this alliance with the Gulf states? This is the question. Was it Assad himself, or was it the wider group in the Syrian Ba'ath and the wider Syrian ruling class, who was those who were still present in Syria, who have certain interests there, who were interested in defending those and wanted to pursue an alliance with the Gulf states, chasing the promises of sanctions relief and of the removal of the siege on the country imposed by US imperialism. There was even some rumblings in the Western press back in September of the need to negotiate with and potentially remove some of the sanctions on Syria. So this was something that was kicking around in the atmosphere. So talking of, did Russia or Iran sell Syria out? I don't think that that is the case. And I think that what is the case is that there is a group within the Syrian government. Remember, the last Syrian cabinet is largely still in place. They made a deal with various interested parties on the other side, and it was them with other parties involved that basically said that to Assad that he had to step down. What is clear to me anyway is that the balance of forces within that Syrian government moved against the alliance with Russia and the alliance with Iran, and a certain section of them, the decisive section of them, I think, moved towards being allied with the Gulf states. And that meant getting rid of the old, more, shall we say, traditionally Ba'athist army commanders who had won those victories. It meant essentially moving the government towards an alliance with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and possibly others too, with the hope that through them, the relations could be restored with the imperialist countries. That's my interpretation. But certainly the movement towards the Gulf states can't be ignored. And as was observed recently by some, and I think this is broadly correct, or certainly the non-attendance of Assad at this particular conference can be confirmed, is that Assad was meant to go to the BRICS conference in Kazan. He was invited, and he didn't go. So I think he sent the foreign minister, just the same way the Saudis did. Why was that? I think his non-attendance there, where, again, there would have been all kinds of deals to be made, the non-attendance of Assad there points to a decision made internally to continue to pursue, via the alliance with the Gulf states, some kind of rapprochement with imperialism itself. Now, we don't know exactly where Assad stood on any of these things. According to the journalist Vanessa Beeley, who has been resident in Syria for a long time, I believe that she has now left that country. According to her, and I think she should be regarded as a reliable source on these matters, Assad did record a resignation message that was supposed to be broadcast to the Syrian people. This was not broadcast. We don't know why. We can make assumptions as to why. We can guess as to why. But I would like to know very much what was in that message and what his story is. Whether he will tell it or not is another question. Maybe part of the deal as to his stepping down is that he doesn't tell that story. I would be fascinated to know how he, as an individual, saw things. I think that he kept the coalition, his coalition, together throughout the years of rabid hostility from imperialism, the Gulf states, and all kinds of other allies of imperialism through the long period 2011 to 2019. But when the Gulf states switched tactics, they went more with their stronger suit, which was their money rather than their fighting capacity or their mercenaries' fighting capacity. They got the result that they were looking for. And they got this, again, to go back over old ground, but they got this by not by military victories. The final campaign was no real campaign at all. When you compare the performance of the Syrian army in the past 2 weeks with that which actually won the war by 2016-17, the armies paid for by Operation Timber Sycamore had been driven back and largely defeated. Now we can make arguments about why the Russians and the Iranians tried to bargain over with the Turks over the enclave at Idlib, but the fact is that war had been won, and it was lost inside 10 days, maybe even less than that. And that only comes from an internal collapse, as I've said before. But I think the key thing is that we have to consider the reality here more properly, which is that the President Assad, as was the head of a government which represented a variety of interests, including bourgeois interests internal to Syria. And my interpretation of the role of the Arab states is that they came in and slowly built up their influence and essentially bought out the Syrian bourgeois interests within that government. And that is the biggest single factor behind the collapse. There are other reasons, of course, which we will get into in due course when we discuss siege warfare and color revolutions, because these are crucial components of the US strategy. So before we go anywhere else, though, or before we get to anything else, I will pause to say greetings to those who are in the chat. We have Christopher Rogers coming from Hong Kong, People's Republic of China. Almir from Slovenia, the once and future Yugoslavia. Victor, good evening to you. Almir says, all the flavors of socialism have one thing in common, and that's constantly being under siege. Socialism has the best chance of withstanding a long siege when the masses are involved. Indeed. Good evening to Daniel out there in the West Country. Anthony joining us from Prague. Davey, hello to you. Got somebody called Toenails who comes to us from the city of Bath, which is, of course, in the English Southwest. Edward said, good evening. I just wanted to say I don't agree with the argument that Russia and Iran had its handful fighting in Ukraine and supporting Hezbollah. It was internal comprador collapse in Syria. This, to me, is the most likely outcome. I don't think that the Russians and the Iranians sold out Syria, but I think that both were faced with a situation where there wasn't a lot that they could do. Now, one can argue that they got outmaneuvered by the Gulf states and that they didn't do much to stop that. But again, there's a lot of very complicated deals going on in the international relations sphere right now, including between the Russians and some of the Gulf states. So maybe the attitude that both the Iranians and the Russians always took is that they would assist the Syrian government as long as it was requesting them to. And if it no longer desired their assistance, that they weren't going to essentially act without it. How could they? I mean, this isn't like the relationship the US has with its proxies, where it literally gives them orders every single minute of the day and pushes them around. This doesn't seem to be the relationship that Russia and Iran had with the Syrian government, because, of course, neither of those countries are imperialist powers. Hello to Bryce, who comes to us from southern Arizona. Hello to Comrade Terry Eaton, coming to us from the Great English Northwest. Hello to Jerry. Hello to Veshin Pamet, coming to us from Bristol, and also the People's Republic of Bulgaria. Hello to Comrade Jawad and Tim Gray and Lee. Good evening to you. Hello to Jenny in the chat as our moderator. Thank you for being on station. Comrade Ian Foster, more time needed, joining us from Skeggy on the East Coast Riviera. Jacob the Scroll says HTS to be downgraded from a terror group. Well, going to be upgraded to MI6 Employee of the Month, especially for, what's his name, Giuliani. Hello to Diamat from Germany. Hello to Abtin. Greetings to Not a Pacifist over in South Carolina. Edward says, in the long to medium term, are the Russian and Iranian states doomed because they are bourgeois states that don't rely on the masses for support? Well, in the end, both of them will have to Iran will have to complete its revolutionary process and go more in the direction of socialism. It will have to ultimately either expropriate or severely constrain, at the very least, the capitalist elements in Iran, and it will have to move decisively in the direction of having a planned economy. Of course, how Iran does that is up to the masses in Iran. But without moving to a planned economy, without expropriating the capitalists, without, at the very least, severely limiting the power of the capitalist class in Iran, then they are always going to be at risk. Where there is a bourgeoisie that is able to make mischief to advance its interests, it will do. And where you leave them to do that, then it's only going to create problems for you in the medium to long term, as Edward's comment implies. The Russian masses will have to fully absorb the lessons of the fact that they have survived the sanctions war on them so far and resume the fight to restore socialism in Russia, which, again, let's be clear, they have survived the sanctions war because of the legacies of the Soviet Union. They're the industrial and agricultural legacies, which even an article in Harper's Magazine recently admitted that, like, a lot of the agricultural progress on import substitution actually relies on the infrastructure built up under the old collective farms. Their industrial potential, it all has its roots in the Soviet period. So without that, then Russia wouldn't be able to do what it is doing now. And yet still, we get the farce where the Russian government maintained its anti-communist rhetoric, despite the fact that without the communist period, without the Stalin period, without the 5-year plans, without mass industrialization, the Russian state would not have survived. It would have been very easy meat for imperialism if that legacy had been completely destroyed. Thankfully for the Russian masses, that legacy was not destroyed. Hello to Kernio and Nikolai Vissarionovich joining us from the Canada of the Southern Hemisphere. That's New Zealand. In fairness to New Zealand, I don't think it's quite as bad as Canada, but I've never been there, so I don't know. Canada, of course, facing soon to be annexed by Emperor Trump, to be included as the 51st state, or maybe the first open colony on the continental Americas. That is. Apparently, Trump very keen on annexing Canada, maybe less keen on annexing Mexico. It's quite funny, but at the same time, we should be aware of the fact that there is always, and has been for a number of years now, talk of doing military campaigns against Mexico under the guise of fighting the cartels. So be wary that the japing of Trump masks some ugly realities. Now, I don't think they've got a plan to invade Canada as yet. You never know, though. The laughable thing is, I think that they could probably invade Canada and most of the Canadians wouldn't notice. The Canadian army is a joke, doesn't really exist. The British aren't going to object. So if Trump wants an easy victory, he could just walk maybe 3 precincts of American cops into Canada, and the Canadians would give up pretty quickly. If this seems like I'm winding up Canadians, I am. I'm hoping that you prove me wrong. But Canada is basically economically controlled by the United States. Anyway, I mean, I'm joking about them taking it over, but the United States wouldn't need to. Economically, they have a chokehold on Canada, even more arguably than they do on Mexico. Mexico is a far more independent country than Canada. I mean, Canada is just a series of banks and a few mining companies, that are controlled ultimately by the United States, masquerading as a country with a maple leaf pulled over it. Hello to Agricola Urbanus. Hello to Robert Hand joining us from Gainesville, Florida. Agricola is talking about basically the same thing with regard to Syria. Yeah, it seems that the Gulf state role is probably the decisive one, more so than the Turks, certainly more so than the Israelis. Gulf state money and influence is the crucial thing here. And I would argue that for all the periodic spats that the US has with the Saudis, Like the essential role of the Saudis hasn't changed in, well, many decades now, since World War II, and with the UAE and the other Gulf states being the same. These are reactionary comprador regimes. Yes, some of them have taken themselves more in the sort of towards alliances and certainly business deals with China and Russia, but fundamentally they're still serving the US. The US is still a key player there. They remain sources of absolutely bleakest reaction, and any alliance with them is basically opening the door for the influence of the US imperialists themselves. And yeah, it is a potential disaster for you if you trust them for a second. Thankfully, the true revolutionaries in the region, such as the Yemenis, don't, because why on earth would you trust the promises of Mohammed bin Salman? Moving through the comments. Hello to Albert. Hello to also David King. They named me. Edward says, I can't listen to multipolar theorists like Mark Sloboda. They all talk about Erdogan and Israel, the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia, and don't mention or downplay the US, at whom's behest everything is happening. Yeah, you notice that a lot. There's loads of people talking about Erdogan, talking about Israel, Gulf states. Look, as I said, Gulf states are comprador regimes which are still answerable primarily to the US, also less so nowadays, but still to a certain extent to the British as well. Those are still the key players there. And they operate on behalf of imperialism. So if you're going to talk about the regional players, yeah, they do a lot of the heavy lifting. Like the dirty work is, of course, the fighting and the killing and the death squad work is done by the Salafists, the HTS guys. They do the dirty work. The Turks, through their military intelligence, apparently do a lot of the organization and the training and the providing of the weapons and the providing of the pay for these jihadists, who get like hell of a lot of money, far more than some Syrian conscript soldier got. That money will get cut off pretty soon. The Turks can't afford to pay that on their own, and the US won't keep that tap turned on for too much longer. But the idea that Erdogan and Benjamin Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman would all do this on their own? No, none of them have got the capacity to do it on their own. Netanyahu and Erdogan are egocentric enough to believe that they could do it on their own, but both of these are just servants of the US. They don't act without the US. The US was the one putting this in motion. And so I'm always confused as to the intentions of those who don't name the main player. They'll name the secondary characters. They'll make it look as if Erdogan and Netanyahu and the others are driving this on their own. They're not. The money for this comes from the US. Even if some of it comes via the Gulf states, but they act, again, at the behest of the US. They were crucial in terms of moving money around to the foundations of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But again, these were US operations, with the British also playing a decisive role. French too. And so this is an operation of imperialism, which they instigated, they designed, then they implemented it, yes, through their regional proxies, but it's their operation. And if you can't name the main enemy, then you're not really doing analysis. In fact, I would question what it is you actually are doing. Hello to Peter. Good to have you back with us. Hello to Working Prole, who joins us. Edward says it's weird that Assad still hasn't spoken to the former nation, or what happened, just nothing. I think the bourgeoisie of Syria just realized that opposing imperialism isn't in their class interest. Well, it's not just the Syrian bourgeois. That's an awful lot of bourgeois all over the world. I mean, we don't know why Assad's message wasn't played or why he has been silent. Maybe it's all part of the deal to save his neck. I don't know. Certainly, I don't think that the Syrian bourgeois elements who switched sides want him talking anytime soon. And maybe his agreement was to get out with him and his family's life intact was that he went in to retirement and just never said anything ever again. Maybe. I don't know. We will only know if it comes out in time. I'm sure there will be leaks. I'm sure there will be more details available, and we will cover those when we get them. Daniel says, at least the situation in Syria is resulting in one good thing. It's making the West and left expose themselves as supporters of imperialism by cheering the fall of Assad. Yeah, I mean, they've always been like that, but they've really exposed themselves because they went from one tweet saying, stop the Israeli US-sponsored Israeli genocide in Gaza. Then they said the dictator must go, Assad must fall. Then this is all Owen Jones. Then they would say it's terrible. Israel is invading Syria. It's like, well, if you didn't expect that, I mean, this was also true. This is also said by the clowns on the Labour Party left, or better to call them cynical traitors, who have spent years echoing every imperialist talking point about Syria and then said, oh, wow, what's happening now? Israel's invading. Well, what did you expect? Who did you think these rebels were, so to speak, if we want to call them rebels? Who did they think they worked for? Who did they think was doing the fighting all those years in Syria? I mean, you get this with like a lot of unfortunately, it's very prevalent in some of the so-called pro-Palestinian activists. And it's prevalent because, like, unfortunately, for many decades, like the left in the Middle East and like the Arab left nationalist and communist parties have been either sidelined or eradicated, sometimes physically eradicated. And so the way in which the Palestinian cause is framed was not being done anymore by even like the sort of the old social democrats of Fatah. It was being done by the Gulf states, especially through their media and cultural operations, which, as I've said before, these ultimately are answerable to imperialism, to US and British imperialism. So yes, they are able to broadcast critical reporting on the actions of Israel. But looking at their reporting more widely, especially Al Jazeera Arabic, it's monstrously reactionary. But they are the ones who do a lot of the broadcasting about Palestine. Therefore, if you're in academia or media and you want to get something out there, then it's only via Gulf state media operations that you can reach a mass audience. And the Gulf states insist on certain things, which is they are rabidly anti-communist, anti-left nationalist, and they are pro various different forms of reactionary Islam, reactionary versions of Islam. They are also still very anti-Iran. Their attitude on Russia is a little bit more dubious, depends which version of Al Jazeera you're watching. The Al Jazeera Arabic service, though, is always monstrously reactionary. These were people who came out of the old BBC Arabic service, and apparently they brought the same culture with them to their news station. So the Western left, of course, just takes its lead from the coverage provided by Al Jazeera. It's why you got like all these people like Miriam Francois and others who are sort of going around banging the drum over Palestine, immediately like them flipping and being on the same side as Netanyahu when it came to Syria. I mean, a lot of these same people were taking the same dreadful attitude when it came to Libya 13 years ago now. But again, the role of the Gulf states and the people who work for their media operations must be questioned, because these traitors and double dealers and just outright idiots bigged up like the US mercenary armies who were destroying Syria. And Syria now will be destroyed, unfortunately. I wish it was not the case, but this is the most likely outcome. Likely to be divided between however much the US lets Netanyahu grab in the south, I think it'll be considerable. I don't think the US will want the Israelis to swallow too much because it'll get a bit embarrassing. Maybe Trump will allow them to swallow even more. Who knows? But certainly it'll be divided into zones of influence dominated by the Turks in the north. The US will probably try to keep its hold over the grain production and the oil production area. And the Israelis will grab much of the south, and then you'll end up with like pro-US, pro-Israel forces controlling probably quite a bit of the south too. The same way Israel used to have like a collaborationist force in the form of the South Lebanese army when they had their occupation going there for so many years. And of course, for Israel, it also enables them to get an angle on Lebanon as well to increase the pressure on Hezbollah. So these people who were saying they were pro-Palestinian, who were screaming, Assad must go, they either didn't think for 2 seconds about the actual reality of the situation. They either didn't think about, well, who was doing the fighting and who was paying for all of this, or they did and they didn't care, in which case these are cynics whose words on everything can be disregarded. Okay. Hello to Rob, who joins us. Hello to Guy, who says the new Syrian government says it has no problems with Israel, but Israeli bombs are falling. Well, the reason why the Israelis and the US are relentlessly bombing all these sites in Syria is because this reveals what the US overall plan for Syria is, which is they will probably want to keep it nominally one state, but of course it'll be a state covered with different spheres of influence. They won't want to give the Kurds a state. That would cause problems with Ankara, but they will want a state which is a tame client regime, which has maybe they will allow it to have some kind of army, but it'll be an army that is deprived of the advanced weaponry that the old Syrian Arab army had. The Israelis have blown up the entire what was left of the Syrian navy, and now the Israelis have finally achieved a military victory. They have advanced into foreign territory and blown up a load of military resources and managed to claim land without firing a shot. It's the only victory they can actually win. But their plan is clearly, the American plan clearly is to have a client state that has maybe an army, but an army that it can only be used for internal repression. They want a state that's as weak as Lebanon, maybe weaker. And they will certainly not allow any conventional armed force to emerge that can possibly challenge them. That's why they're destroying all of this. Other bits of it will be packed up on transport planes and ships and taken over to Ukraine. I'm certain that the Americans will want to claim as much of the old Soviet stockpile in Syria as possible. That which they don't blow up, they'll ship to Ukraine. That'll be one of the other things that they do. Hello to Alan, who joins us from Oakland, California. Francisco Gomez says this shows that rejecting Marxism or view of labor consciousness hurts nations and communities' well-being and safety. Well, Francisco is right. Veshan Pamet says Assad would have met the same fate as Gaddafi or Saddam if he stayed. He got out just in time. You're probably right. I think the Russians probably insisted on him and his family getting out, and the Gulf states who were paying the bills here were obliged to agree. But yes, like fundamentally, it would have ended the same way for him. So we will know more in future in the future here. Okay. So we will now speak about the title of the video. We kind of got into it a little bit, but like the U.S. usage of siege warfare. The U.S. usage of siege warfare, of course, goes back a long time. Even the Washington Post was obliged to admit that the sanctions on various different countries, including Syria, went back all the way to the 1970s. Now, you can see, and I'm going to just share with you here a screen which shows the Washington Post recent article on this, which is interesting, despite, of course, it being in the Bezos Post. But if you see here on the chart, you can see the slow increase throughout the Clinton and Bush eras of the usage of sanctions, and the real jump in the Trump and the explosion in the Biden era. Now, what starts to happen is, of course, they start to use more and more sanctions as they achieve more and more control over the international trade system, so that they're able to sanction people remotely. They're able to sanction whole states remotely. They're able to put on secondary sanctions to hit states that trade with, or entities that trade with states under sanctions. And so it really gave them an unprecedented amount of control via siege warfare. Now, of course, this has backfired on them finally. They are now facing the reality, which is if you do this a lot, you are going to force people to innovate their way around your sanctions, which is starting to happen now. Not nearly quick enough, I would say. Not nearly quick enough. But it is happening now. So this is the state of play with regard to the US's usage of sanctions. Now, as the Washington Post actually notes, and it's useful to read the bourgeois press when they actually note something that is true. So I'll just read to you directly from the article. Sanctions, or even just the threat of them, can be an effective policy tool, way to punish bad behavior or pressure an adversary without resorting to military force. Sanctions have allowed the US to take moral, economically meaningful stands against perpetrators of war crimes, other than themselves, that is. They helped bring an end to South Africa's apartheid regime, that's dubious at best, and contributed to the eventual overthrow of the Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic. So they then admit that, of course, that certain countries have got around them, such as the DPRK and Nicaragua, and we'll look at why in just a moment. But they do tell us the essential truth there, which is that the US imposes these so it can avoid old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy, meaning you sail the US Navy into some place and try and blow it up. Now, of course, they still do that, but they prefer to use the methods of what is essentially a 21st century form of siege warfare, where you can cut off the not just certain pieces of trade, but almost all trade to a nation via threatening to apply secondary sanctions on people. Of course, Venezuela's been hit hard by this. They've been throwing every sanction they can possibly find at the DPRK for over 30 years, and as the Washington Post admits, it hasn't worked. But they have a certain aim when they are placing these sanctions on these different governments, and as the Washington Post article admits, it's to act without needing to resort to military measures. The aim of this is this modern day version of siege warfare is, of course, to, well, much like old fashioned siege warfare, it's to break the spirit of those who are under siege, and it's to make it so that those who are being affected by this cease their support for the government that has, of course, offended the interests of US imperialism. And this is where you get the color revolution element coming in. But the siege warfare element is there to disrupt the ability of the government to function, disrupt its ability to do basic things such as even buying food internationally, and this is something which governments which are dependent upon imports, of course, are going to be especially vulnerable to. And the aim of it is to secure the collapse of a government which US imperialism sees as a threat to its interests, which can be disposed of without resorting to rather more messy and risky operations, such as military operations. And this is, of course, why they are enamored with it, because the US still, despite the claims of George H.W. Bush, hasn't got over Vietnam syndrome. They still don't want to get involved in a messy, protracted war, which will result in a lot of US casualties. They want to secure the collapse of governments ideally without them having to fire a shot. That's the theory behind this. So if we go back to the example of Syria, what happened there was that really the sanctions in the end did have an effect, it seems. The Syrian government was unable to, for reasons which we could get into, we will get into in future episodes, was unable to address the harms that these were causing. And of course, this caused, it seems, certain factions to desperately seek a deal to preserve their own class interests. And this is what was meant to happen, by the way, in Russia. What was meant to happen in Russia, and this is the reason why the Biden administration hit the Russian capitalist classes' investments in the West, and it hit them harder than the Russian government ever hit them, believe it or not. So what they did was, the reason why they went after the oligarchy, the reason why they went after their seized their property, froze money in international bank accounts, seized football clubs in the case of Chelsea, though, the British government is welcome to Chelsea FC. The reason why they did all that wasn't because suddenly the US imperialists were repulsed by the way these people made their money. It was to try and achieve a result in Russia which would be similar to what has been achieved in Syria. That's what they were hoping. They were hoping for a revolt of the capitalist class, and that would ultimately end with the removal of Putin as president. That's what they hoped for. And so the way that this was meant to go was that you place this blitz of sanctions on Russia. You then, of course, hope to demoralize the Russians by being able to present the Ukrainian side as having won military victories. This, of course, isn't something that is necessarily true, but the information operation that the US and the British run, they hoped to make it look as if they were winning certain victories, even if they weren't. And this all together with an assault on the interests of the Russian capitalist class would cause a revolt which would end in a palace coup or a color revolution type situation, which would see Putin removed. And therefore, you wouldn't need to win on the battlefield. You wouldn't need to sustain a Ukrainian army for 2 years, which is what they've had to do, if you could guarantee an internal revolt of the Russian capitalist class. Now, why did it not work in the case of Russia? Well, we've gone into this many times. I will reiterate briefly. It didn't work in the case of Russia because they had that Soviet industrial and agricultural legacy to lean into and to build on. It didn't work because when it comes to import substitution, the Russian government took that seriously enough to build up their agricultural capacity to negate the sanctioning of Western agricultural products. They also were able to negate the danger to them posed by sanctions because the oil and gas sanctions were filled with holes. They were filled with holes because the demand remains, even in the West, even in the United States itself, for Russian gas, Russian oil, Russian uranium as well. I believe that Russian uranium is still sold to the United States, who, of course, give themselves get-out clauses for all of their sanctions, conveniently enough. So the fact that the Russia is able to carry out, or was able to so far carry out, a comprehensive import substitution regime meant that by the time that the barrage of sanctions arrived, 8 years after the intensification of sanctions on Russia by the Obama administration, and then of course went further under Trump, completed under Biden. By the time the special military operation was launched, they'd done enough import substitution in terms of agriculture and industry to render the worst effects of these sanctions to render them ineffectual, so that they weren't in a position, the Russians, where the population was facing a severe shortage of food due to the sanctions regime. They weren't hit by that. They weren't in a situation where shop shelves suddenly went empty, which was the case in Venezuela at certain points due to the sanctions regime there. And so the idea there was that they were going to get a revolt of the bourgeois against the Russian government. This didn't materialize, and it also didn't materialize because I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between the Russian capitalist class and the government. Russian capitalist class is a constituency which the Russian government, headed by Putin, has to take seriously. But one of the advantages of having a Bonapartist regime is that the Russian capitalist class is one constituency amongst many. The Russian capitalist class does not have veto power over what the Russian government does, not in the way that it would have done in the Yeltsin period or even in the early Putin period. Now, can they still make trouble? Yes. Does Putin continually have to make concessions to them? Yes. But do they wield the power over the Russian state that the US imperialists thought they did? No. And that is that combination of reasons is why the calculation made by the Biden administration and their intelligence men that you would get a revolt of the bourgeois and you would get possibly a palace coup. This didn't happen. That and the fact that the Russian state very sensibly wrapped up and marginalized or pushed out an awful lot of the NGO operations that were running around in Russia in the 90s and the early to mid 2000s. And a lot of them got pushed out, shut down, marginalized. And so they weren't able to carry on their information and intelligence war that they've used in other countries. You see, a key part of the color revolution strategy that's been used by the US and the British and the French and the Germans over the last 30 years is that they've been using these color revolution strategies against countries that do not have the level of mass mobilization, mass working class and peasantry politicization that a country like Venezuela or Nicaragua has. Where they both have very politicized mass movements that rally behind their government in times of crisis. They also have systems of workers' democracy in both countries, which allow a certain role of the masses in the governing at least of their local areas. And of course, in Venezuela, you have the workers' militia system. So there, even though there is still a capitalist class in Venezuela, you have at least a counterbalance to them by a politicized, organized, and armed working class and peasantry who are prepared to defend the Bolivarian revolution. That makes the elements of color revolution that you have worked in other places which don't have that not as applicable, because you look at the history of color revolutions. If you look at, say, let's use Georgia as an example, because it's in the news at the moment. The post-Soviet system there was very unstable, very corrupt, and was run by basically the oligarchs' choices. So Edvard Shevardnadze being one of them. Now, Shevardnadze had, of course, he'd started his career. He was Georgian. He'd started his career in Georgia as a Tbilisi party official, and then he became, I think, first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party in the late 70s. Of course, he was a revisionist rat who played his part in the destruction of the Soviet Union. But he came to power in the mid-90s, 95, and lasted to 2003 before he was removed in the Rose Revolution, if anybody remembers that. Now, the reason why someone like Shevardnadze could just be pushed out is that the US and the Europeans and the British flooded Georgia for years using the Yugoslav example with NGOs, paid-for media organizations, overt and covert intelligence operations designed to build themselves up a mass base of support by moving a lot of money around, so that when they felt like they needed to get rid of old Shevardnadze, if he finally reached a point where he wasn't useful to them anymore, they could mobilize to get rid of him. So what do you do in a color revolution? A color revolution is like a sort of It's a bad cover version of revolutionary activity. It's a composite of various different aspects of revolution, but put together and rendered harmless to imperialist interests. So it's designed to have the aesthetics of revolution, but none of the content. So you get the mass street mobilizations. I mean, a lot of this you'll see has a lot in common with how the people's democracies and then finally the USSR fell, but certainly the people's democracies. You get mass mobilizations in the streets. You get a gigantic information operation being run by the imperialist media out in the streets. You get various different BBC and CNN and reporters running around screaming like things like, "The people here, Martin, are demanding democracy. The autocrats in their palace are not listening. How long before the regime falls? People say it cannot be long. They want freedom." You know, those kind of BBC type reports. We've all seen them. And what that does is, of course, it taps into a good degree of what is referred to in the business as soft power as well. And that is the dominance of Western, principally US, but also British and to a certain extent European as a whole culture inside these countries. And there's a reason for the fact that the US and the British and others, all the imperialists, push their culture very hard in all of these places, be it film, TV, music, but also things like, you know, cuisine, everything, all forms of media, and everything to do with the supposed life that people have in the West is pushed as this relentlessly positive image in these countries, and it's designed to win people over to a pro imperialist position, whether they know that that's what they are doing or not. Because, of course, life in the West is presented as this unending parade of, well, depending upon which target audience you're going for a never-ending parade of parties, of free and often debauched sexual liaisons, a never-ending stream of wealth where one can own a mansion, or anybody can own a mansion. I mean, I'm sounding like I'm being hyperbolic here, but these are impressions of Britain that I've heard said to me when I've been in other countries, particularly Central and Eastern European countries. This is the impression that some people do have about what life in Britain is like, is that it's a life of tremendous wealth, that everybody is rich, or at least everybody is middle class. This is the image they put out there, and this is why cultural influencing operations are so important. The other image, of course, is that the image of the unbeatability of particularly US imperialism. That if US imperialism is against you, you cannot ever possibly beat them due to, you know, their control of various things. They are militarily unbeatable, which isn't true. They are economically unbeatable. If they turn against you, there is no hope of fighting back against them. We know the propaganda. But this is, of course, all of the weight that they are bringing to bear when they they put a country under siege and they seek to carry through a color revolution. They are depending upon this image of themselves that they have carefully cultivated, of their, you know, the tremendous wealth that exists there. That you too can have access to this wealth if you just go along with what imperialism demands. If this is sounding like a pyramid scheme, well, you might be right. And so people go for it, especially in the bourgeois. And what happens is they mobilize people on the streets. They declare siege warfare on a nation. It's like they're doing on Georgia now. And what they want to do is they, particularly in a pro, if it's a pro-capitalist government, when they lay siege to it, when they put people in the street, where they try and stage all kinds of provocations to amp up the anger and amplify the violence, what they hope to do is to cause the governing elite to crack, and for a section of them to defect to the other side. because that's what happens if you look back at all of the color revolutions, going back to the days of the last days of Milosevic himself. This is what happened. Ultimately, Milosevic most likely won those final elections that were so contested, but it didn't matter. The US had trained enough professional activists to get out there on the street and make a noise. And were combined with the sanctions warfare on Yugoslavia, what it produced in the end was a situation where a certain part of the elite that had been with Milosevic for a while defected to the other side and basically arrested him. And so, said to Milosevic, look, Slobodan, you better go. It's all over. And he went because, again, being an old school Titoite cadre, which is what he was, Milosevic had no means and had no ability to mobilize those who still wanted to preserve what was left of Yugoslavia and who voted for him. He had no means and no ability to mobilize them. If he even considered it, somebody probably told him, well, if you do that, it'll be civil war. Despite the fact that what you got was war upon the Serbian and Montenegrin working class anyway, just as you did in Russia. And so he had no means and he had no ability, he had no political ability to appeal to the masses. And the thing is, that's the only defense that you've got. But the reason why the color revolutions worked in Serbia or Yugoslavia, in Georgia, more recently in Armenia, and in other places too, is where the masses have no role, where rule is principally carried out by a small elite group. And if part of that elite defects to the other side, then the rulers are fucked. Because again, if they have no means to appeal to the masses, if the masses will not come out for them, if you have not prepared the ground for this, because you can't just click your fingers as some bourgeois ruler who's never done it before and demand that the people rise to defend you when you've never prepared the ground for this. You haven't the networks in place to carry out the mobilization. There is your very class basis of your organization is against mass mobilizations of the workers and the peasants. Then you stand no chance of doing it. And so color revolutions work when it is they are targeted against all oligarchic regimes that depend upon a network of probably quite corrupt individuals who, when threatened by the empire, when threatened by the US, when facing what appear to be mass mobilizations, have no idea how to respond to it. And they look at the fact that they are under siege. They see their property being threatened by US sanctions. And so they say, fuck it, we'll switch sides. Which is what happened ultimately in Ukraine twice, most devastatingly in 2014. Even those elements in the Ukrainian capitalist class that had supported Yanukovych, and there were the elements there, ultimately they switched sides and went with the pro-US imperialist side, and Yanukovych lost that support, and he had no ability or desire to rally the masses in his defense. He flirted with the idea, and then essentially he was told that if he did that, he'd be killed, and so just fled. So the places where this tactic has not worked are those where the masses are politicized and active and armed ideologically and politically to resist. So where you still have the dictatorship of the proletariat, for instance, in the DPRK, where you still have that to a certain extent in a place like Cuba, where you have the mass mobilization system that you have in Venezuela or Nicaragua. And so where that is in place, even if there's still a bourgeoisie present, like there is in Venezuela, at least provides a counterbalance. Because if you can mobilize, if you as a leader can mobilize the armed people in your defense, that causes the reactionary forces to be more hesitant. It means that they are running a great deal more risk in mobilizing against you. And it means if you can bring out onto the street millions of workers in your defense, then that does have correctly an intimidatory effect upon the reactionaries who realize they're in a very small minority and they can't hope to win a violent encounter. Those who don't have that ability are much more limited in what they can do if they're just relying on the state forces. And relying on the state forces, especially in a bourgeois state that is under siege from imperialism, is always dodgy because you're relying upon the loyalty of not just the men who are swinging the batons for you, but also their commanders and their senior officers who are wide open to influence operations, bribery, threats, intimidation by the imperialists, who will work round the clock to find the weaknesses of your state officials and exploit them. Again, the only real defense is the mobilization of the masses. Now, whether the Georgian Dream Party will be able to hang on, I don't know. They have been able to so far. It will be damaging to the imperialists if this color revolution attempt fails, but they will try again. They will try relentlessly, and they will be able to keep trying because, again, the contradictions and the failures of Georgian capitalism mean that you've got an awful lot of people there who have not won in the slightest from the restoration of capitalism in Georgia, and who are angry about it, and who are unfortunately they are easy prey for the propaganda of the imperialists. Same is true in a place like Armenia. So how did you get an absolute clown coming to power, as you have done in Armenia, who's such an obvious stooge of the West? So how do you get a Pashinyan coming in there? Well, he's the tool of the imperialists, clearly, but also he was able to succeed in this color revolution partly because, again, some of the Armenian domestic ruling class defected to him, undermining the previous rulers, but also the Armenian capitalism was a weak and rather feeble creation. And there's an awful lot of people who lost out from the restoration of capitalism in Armenia. And when the imperialists come in, offering big money to come and work for one of their networks, a lot of people take that money and become tied by their interests to imperialism. And again, like the ordinary capitalist regimes can't really withstand that. Only those who are moving in the direction of socialism can truly hope to withstand this kind of pressure. Because the other thing, of course, is that you need, if not absolute, then near self-reliance in terms of the essentials of life, meaning the ability to feed the population, the ability to keep the lights on, the ability to keep working with keep the workplaces open when the sanctions are hitting very hard. If you've got the ability to do those things, it means that the two approaches imperialism uses to countries which it seeks to put under siege those tools are blunted to a degree. Because if you can't starve people out, you can't hope to turn them against the government as easily. And if you can't literally switch the lights off, then again, like, it's much more difficult to disrupt economic activity. So almost a big guarantee against the modern form of siege warfare is, of course, moving in the direction of agricultural and industrial and in terms of power terms, self-reliance, which is why, of course, you've had Nicaragua move in the direction of self-reliance in agriculture. Because if you don't need to rely upon the imperialist-dominated trade system for food, that does provide you with considerable more room for maneuver. So it's not that there aren't ways around these situations, the tactics of imperialism. It's just that the only sure way around them is either, as the Russians have been able to do, being able to draw on this gigantic legacy of socialism from the past, or, in the case of the DPRK, being still a workers' state, or in the case of Venezuela or Nicaragua, being a state which has the capacity to mobilize the masses, but which is also taking sensible decisions and moving towards self-reliance. These are the ways to actually stop these weapons being deployed against you, or at least damage their effectiveness. And I'll leave the comments there to take questions. So we've got 439 of you watching. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Right. Hello to Beiju, who's joined us, who says, "How will the fall of Syria affect Yemen?" Unclear at this stage. I don't think it'll be fatal to them, because the Yemenis are an interesting example, because they are Ansar Allah very much are a movement of the Yemeni masses, and they've proven their ability to govern the areas of Yemen they control. And there's a reason why the bulk of the Yemeni population lives in these areas. It's because they're a much more effective government than the regime that's run as a puppet entity by the Saudis. So they have ways in which the masses are continually mobilized, and I believe they've made an awful lot of innovations with regard to agriculture in Yemen. So they've made a lot of innovations when it comes to weapons technology, and when it comes to agriculture. They've really, under full-blown siege of imperialism, they've really achieved quite a lot in terms of self-reliance. So I don't think it'll be fatal for the Yemenis. The Israelis are going to try and bomb them again, but unless the Israelis want to march their army into Yemen, it's not going to work. The Saudis bombed them relentlessly for a decade. It killed a lot of people. It inflicted a lot of misery, but it didn't break them. The Israelis won't have any more luck on this than the US did, and the British and the Saudis did. Stanislav Tomov says, "You're not hyperbolic at all about the image of the Western way of life. You'll laugh to death if you know what people believed about the West in the 90s. Many still believe." Yeah, I should just do a tour where I go around various Eastern European places, showing them the price of things in Britain. That'd dispel a few things. Nehat says, "As a spectator in this crisis, I came to the conclusion that paying attention to the foreign ministers is very important. In this case, Lavrov, Fidam, Blinken, Irakshi, etc. The rest is theatre. Speeches of foreign ministers have important hints in them." Yeah, that's true. The Iranian foreign minister and envoy, I believe it was Larijani, dropped some very big hints as to what was going on in Damascus. These are interesting times. Judith says, "Yemen congratulated Syria on their successful revolution." Well, what they said was that they hoped that the new Syrian government would join the struggle, against Israel, and that Yemen would help them defend their country against Israel, which is it's an interesting statement. I think that what it does is it adopts an interesting method, which is what you take what your opponent says, in this case the Western-sponsored jihadists claim in their propaganda that they're against Israel, and you say, "Okay, lads, you're in power now. We will help you defend your country. Get to it." And strangely enough, for now at least, nothing will happen, because again, the US is giving the orders, and the HTS scumbags are too busy lynching people and burning people alive to bother with the Israeli incursions into Syrian territory. Bear in mind that the Yemenis won to their side a lot of people who had been allied with like Al-Qaeda type operations in Yemen, and they did so by being the most relentless and diligent fighters for national liberation. Because a lot of the characters who in Yemen who'd been aligned with Al-Qaeda had done so for various different reasons. They weren't all mercenaries. Some of them were Yemenis, and they had to fight Ansar Allah for a while, but they did manage to win some of them at least over to their side, because some of them were men who'd been misled into thinking that Al-Qaeda was some kind of organization that was actually waging war on the West. This isn't true. It's been, for the great majority of its existence, it is a Western asset, still is to this day. And of course, we are now being told that the US is preparing 11,000 ISIS fighters to try and invade Iraq again. Haven't seen that materialize yet, but again, wouldn't surprise me if it was true. Abtin says the Ba'athist movement weren't anti-imperialist in any coherent way. They were more of a third path, not communist, not fully Western. Nationalist movements enforced by the army. Yes. Ocean 2035 said we should remember that Afghanistan is now more against imperialism than ever before. Well, this is the Taliban, who are welcome on this show. They are an interesting bunch. It's a very diverse, heterogeneous organization. There's a lot of very reactionary figures within it, but they've been left in a situation where, I mean, first of all, a lot of the former American colonial authorities in Afghanistan just defected to them, and they've been left essentially trying to run a country with very few resources and which had essentially fallen apart. They've turned, by necessity, to the only two countries that can really help them, which are China and Russia. So now you've got the Russians declassifying them and taking them out of the terrorist category. You've got significant Chinese investment going in. You've actually got more industry and infrastructure building starting to take place now in Afghanistan than took place for 20 years under the US. Imperialism had no real interest in building anything there. I mean, there's an argument to be made that they were just extracting poppies to take and turn into opiates in the US. That was their principal usage of Afghanistan. But now you're starting to get serious investment. Now, the Taliban are becoming players in various different Eurasian economic organizations, which, as I've said before, will be, if this is successful, that will force changes ultimately inside Afghanistan itself. So it's an interesting situation. Right. Sid says, indeed, it is true that Al-Qaeda does mean the base, and was the name American intel gave to its database of Saudi mercenaries that helped compose the Mujahideen. That's interesting. If the name came from an American database, that would be hilariously fitting. CJ says, on that point, what about the 11,000 soldiers trained to invade Iraq? Could Iraq go the same way as Syria? Do they have manpower and will? Iraq, different situation, I think. First of all, you already have the popular mobilization units who successfully defeated ISIS/Al-Qaeda a decade ago. So they've got the experience of doing it. They've got Iran right next door. And even with the Pezeshkian types in the presidency, you are not going to see the Iranians allow Iraq to fall under the rule of pro-US Salafists. So I think that whatever they're going to try in Iraq, it will create chaos. It will kill people, certainly, but it won't succeed. I'm pretty confident it won't succeed. The Iraqis have still got problems, though, which is that they need to chase out that US occupation. Like, you can't leave them in there. Just like in Syria, it was disastrous to have the US sat there in the north in the oil and wheat producing zone. Would have been difficult to drive them out of there, but not impossible. But leaving them there was a real disastrous move, because there wasn't that many of them. But they had their dirty deal with the Kurds in the form of the SDF. But when it comes to Iraq, look, the national liberation of Iraq needs to be completed. And that means driving the US out and getting a government in place which is much more sovereign and isn't looking over its shoulder whatever stunt the US imperialists are going to pull next. So I am fairly confident that the Iraqis, with aid from the Iranians, will defeat this US-sponsored Al-Qaeda invasion that apparently they're cooking up. But then they need to go on from there, and the US forces that remain in Iraq need to be removed. And the US, and to be honest with you, you could do with severing relations with the US imperialists entirely, who don't bring anything other than death and destruction. But removing that US troop presence is an absolute necessity. How they do it, of course, is up to the masses in Iraq, but you cannot leave an occupation army there. It is only there to cause disruption and chaos in Iraq, and the Iraqis will need to wage a national liberation struggle to remove it. Aren't Kurds on the left? Asks Paul. Which Kurds? I mean, if we're talking about the Barzani group in northern Iraq, certainly not. This is a group that has been they've been puppets of imperialism for 30 years or more. The Kurds in northern Syria, well, they were sold as being like, well, Murray Bookchin inspired anarchist revolutionaries. They are now in a force that is essentially a militia of US imperialism. That's what the SDF is. So whatever they were at one stage, they are now, objectively speaking, fighters for US imperialism and should be regarded as such. All right. Okay. So we are hitting the 9 o'clock mark. I am going to, thanks to all 437 of you watching at the moment, I am going to probably continue this discussion to a certain extent tomorrow on the program. Come back here, same time, same place tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thanks to everybody who supports the program on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I will be doing the show tomorrow, and we'll continue this discussion then. But we'll also tomorrow be covering the latest developments from the Ukrainian front line. So be sure to join me for that. And then later in the week, we'll be looking at the updates coming from the imploding in former industrial colossus of Europe, that is Germany. We've got an interview coming up on Friday this week with some German comrades, so keep an eye out for that. We also have the next episode of Decline and Fall with myself and Kit Clarenberg coming to you tomorrow as well. So thanks to everybody who's tuned in, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Утреннего в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы. Вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
Продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Не стой, снегопад, не реке верный богат. Знаменитости планеты, осенили твой отряд. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный отряд впереди.
دا وطن 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 دا دل افغان وطن دا پمونګ ګران وطن دا پمونګ ګران وطن دا پمونګ ګران وطن خاور د غیرت د زلزلې لري طوفان لري غرونو کې بازان لري غرونو کې بازان لري غرونو کې بازان لري خاور د غیرت د زلزلې لري طوفان لري غرونو کې بازان لري غرونو کې بازان لري غرونو کې بازان لري سرنا د اسمان سرا نن غودا ایمان سرا کاری دغو سرنا د اسمان سرا نن غودا ایمان سرا دا وطن 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 دا دل افغان